who study here are solving real-world problems that go out and make people's lives better. Okay, we are a world-changing institution, we're worldwide, so one of my favourite things is like in the staff room, you'll hear people talking to each other in loads of different languages, and you'll pick up on that as you kind of explore the city today. And then hopefully you've got this from the students you've just been talking to. Students from your schools come and study at Oxford. Okay? So it's a really important message for you to hear, I think. Right, that is me kind of doing the shameless plugging, but we've talked about the physical environment, and you're experiencing that. We've met some students. I also wanted to give you a taste of the intellectual environment. So amazingly, Temi's agreed to speak to us. I'm just looking at the back. If you want to come down, Temi, that would be brilliant. And one of the things that we're really privileged in Oxford is that people are researching different things, and their own academic interests really come through in what they're doing. So just whilst Temi gets set up, just reflect on what I've said, take a breather, and also, we're in a lecture theatre. We're in a space of learning. If you were in a university lecture right now, what would you be doing? Taking notes. So, if you want to maybe grab something to write, even if it's an app on the phone or something like that, get yourself in the headspace of learning, okay? And we'll just transition over.
And also multiple pens, have you got? Choose to
Having you guys. My name is Dr. Temi Ogunye. I'm going to present to you today, but before I do so, I thought I would just comment on, because I was in the back listening to what the three people who were speaking to you just now were saying, and I thought I would just kind of emphasize that you should really listen to those guys, because they were talking some sense, right? I grew up in Brixton, went to school in South London, the State School in South London. I applied to come to Oxford, got an interview, luckily. If only I had that kind of advice. I failed to get the interview, right? I was kind of bummed out when it happened, but I'm here now, so they made the wrong decision. But if only I had advice like that to listen to. I was kind of all at sea on my own. I didn't know what I was doing, trying to put it together. Came up here on my own. My mom was like, good luck. And I was like, yeah, let's see what happens, Mom. And then it didn't work out, but it wasn't the end of the world. But if I had that kind of advice, it might have, and I would have felt at least much more at ease when I came up here. So I would just really encourage you to kind of take on board everything you're learning today. It's all going to be really helpful. At the very least, it will just make you feel less anxious about the whole application process. But another lesson to take from the little story I just told you is that it's kind of not the end of the world, right? Obviously, Oxford is an amazing place to be. I wouldn't have applied for a job here if it wasn't, but I didn't get to Oxford. I went to Manchester Uni instead, which is another excellent university. I did my master's. I'm from London. I did my master's at UCL, which is another great university. I did my PhD at LSE, which is another good university. So it's kind of, you don't have to go to Oxford in order to do well in life, right? So don't freak out and think that if this doesn't work out and you somehow failed and everything else is going to go badly. That's not true. If someone tells you that, they're talking nonsense, okay? So obviously try if you want to do it. Don't freak out if it doesn't work out. Very happy to answer any questions about that sort of stuff after the presentation. I was imagining I'd be answering like scholarly questions about my presentation, but also happy to answer kind of more general questions about how I got here or how you might get here if you want to. Okay, having said all of that, as you can see, my name is Dr. Temi Ogunye. I'm a research fellow in political theory here at Oxford. So Hugh very kindly invited me to present some of my work to you today, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to present a paper that I'm working on, which I haven't yet finished. Haven't even written a full draft of it yet, and I haven't actually presented these ideas to anyone as they are yet, so you guys are the first to hear them. I'm quite keen to hear what you think. As you can see, The title is Social Norms and Informal Activism. Okay, so let me get started. So, to start the introduction, so very roughly, a social norm is an obligatory behavioural rule that is shared by a social group where the rule is not enshrined in law. Okay? That's a bit abstract. Let me give you some examples. So, examples include the rule that you should queue when you're waiting for a bus, or the rule that you should wear black at funerals. Those are two examples of social norms. So as these examples show, social norms are one of the key building blocks of social life. So partly because they are so important, those who seek to remedy social ills or change society for the better, so we can call these people activists, sometimes they target social norms. So the activists sometimes identify social norms as their targets. Let me give you some examples. So examples include transgender inclusion activists who have introduced the social norm of referring to people by using their preferred pronouns. Another example is anti-racism activists who argue that we need to more rigorously enforce social norms against racism and white supremacy in the light of Donald Trump's election as president of the US. So those are just two examples of ways that activists target social norms. We could think of many more. So I'm going to refer to activists who target social norms as informal activists, and I'm going to call the acts that they engage in acts of informal activism. So what I'm calling informal activism has been in the spotlight in recent years because there's increasing, on the one hand, there's increasing awareness of the importance of social norms, but on the other, there is disagreement about how social norms should be targeted. So one especially intense area of disagreement relates to the phenomenon commonly known as call-out or cancel culture. So these terms are often used in an extremely broad and imprecise way, but one way to understand the phenomenon is as this. So the practice of expressing public disapproval of and thereby imposing social costs on those who comply with harmful social norms or fail to comply with beneficial ones. So I'm going to play you a video from an event in October 2019 where former US President Barack Obama referred to this practice.
This idea of purity and you're never compromised and you're always politically woke and all that stuff, you should get over that quickly. The world is messy. There are ambiguities. People who do really good stuff have flaws. People who you are fighting may love their kids. And, share certain things with you. And I think that one danger I see among young people, particularly on college campuses, Malia and I talked about this. Yara goes to school with my daughter. But I do get a sense sometimes now among certain young people, and this is accelerated by social media, there is this sense sometimes of the way of me making change is to be as judgmental as possible about other people. And that's enough. Like if I tweet or hashtag about how you didn't do something right or used the wrong verb, or then I can sit back and feel pretty good about myself because, man, you see how woke I was? I called you out. When I get on TV, watch my show, watch rubbish. That's not activism. That's not bringing about change. If all you're doing is casting stones, you're probably not going to get that far. That's easy to do.
Similarly, so taking Obama, similarly, in July 2020, various prominent public figures, including Margaret Atwood, J.K. Rowling, and others, signed an open letter decrying, quote, a censoriousness spreading in our culture, end quote, which was said to include, quote, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, end quote. According to the authors of this letter, quote, the way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away, end quote. So my aim in this paper is to interrogate these kinds of claims as they pertain to social norms and informal activism. Is it true to say that casting stones is not activism and is not going to achieve change? Is persuasion the way to defeat bad ideas and ultimately change social norms? More generally, how should informal activism be practiced? So in this presentation, I'm going to give a very general overview of the argument that I'm planning to make, partly because I only have a short amount of time, and partly because the full paper hasn't been written yet, so I've still got to iron out quite a lot of the details. I'm going to skip over some areas very quickly, but if you have any questions about anything at all, please make sure you ask me in the Q&A. If something I've said isn't clear, then it's my fault and not yours. Right? That's an important lesson that you should actually take whatever university you go to. Right? You should, if someone said something unclear, then they've not made it clear enough for you, and they need to explain it. So here's a plan of the argument. So first, I'm going to argue that despite what Atwood, Rowling, and the other signatories to the open letter say, persuasion is limited as a form of informal activism. Second, I highlight an alternative means of informal activism, which I take to correspond to the phenomenon known as call-out or cancel culture. I call this alternative means price setting, draw a distinction between high and low price setting, and explain why my discussion focuses primarily on the latter. Third, in order to understand how price setting should be practiced, we must first have a better understanding of what social norms are and how they work. So that's what I do in section 3. Fourth, I highlight the promise of price setting as a form of informal activism. So I think, despite what Obama says, price setting, i.e. casting stones, can bring about change. Finally, I identify a pitfall of price setting, but one that has so far not been highlighted by the critics of call-out or cancel culture. So let's get going. So persuasion and its limits. So as I read the people who signed that letter that I just mentioned, when they say that the way to defeat bad ideas is by persuasion, what they mean is that persuasion is the only reliably effective means of informal activism. So in section 1 of the paper, I first develop an account of what persuasion involves, and then identify some limits of persuasion as a means of informal activism. So I think that highlighting that persuasion is limited is not as reliably effective as it may seem, should clear the way for us to consider alternative forms that informal activism could take. So I'm going to skip over my discussion of persuasion completely, but for now, let's just say that persuasion is a form of influence that involves getting someone to do or believe something by offering them good reasons for doing or believing that thing. So I'm not going to spend much time on the limits of persuasion either, but let me give you a brief idea. I think that there are 3 reasons why persuasion is limited, and here's a brief summary of those reasons. So the first is that social norms are embedded in kind of networks of ideas, and sometimes the way in which they're embedded in those ideas can limit the effectiveness of persuasion. That's a kind of summary of a much more complex argument. This idea is much simpler. So often it is those who are disadvantaged by a social norm who are most likely to be offering the good reasons to change that norm. And sometimes prejudice can mean that the testimony of the people who are disadvantaged is just ignored or downplayed. The third set of reasons are that human beings don't always process information or make decisions in the way that kind of scholarly models of rationality expect them to. We can call these departures from scholarly models of rationality, cognitive biases. You might be familiar with those. So sometimes these mean that persuasion is not as reliably effective as it might seem. So those are the reasons, there are probably more reasons why I think persuasion is limited. And so once you see that persuasion is limited, you start to think, what else might we use as informal activism? So as I said, the point of highlighting the limits of persuasion is to suggest that it might not be as reliably effective as it first seems. And this fact should prompt us to consider alternatives to persuasion. So the alternative that I want to focus on is what I call price setting. So price setting, as it says here, is a form of influence that involves inducing a person or group of people to do X, so some action, by proposing to advance their interests if they do X, or to set back their interests if they don't do X. So price setting works by providing its targets with incentives to engage in the desired behavior. So for an illustration of how price setting works and can be used as a form of informal activism, consider the following example. In May 2019, after the birth of the son of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, aka Harry and Meghan, the broadcaster Danny Baker posted this on Twitter. As you can see, it is a photo of a well-dressed white couple escorting a similarly well-dressed chimpanzee out of the building. The text accompanying the tweet reads, "Royal baby leaves hospital." So given the ancestry of the newborn baby, Meghan's mother is African American, and the long history of racist association between black people and monkeys, many people rightly denounced the tweet as racist. And Baker was fired from his job as a host of a popular BBC radio show. This, I think, is an example of price setting. The social norm prohibiting racism is enforced by making sure it is known that those who violate the social norm will have their interests set back. That is, they will face costs. So there's a debate going on in the media and elsewhere, you guys might be having the same debate, I don't know, about what, if anything, cancel culture refers to and whether we should continue to use that phrase. I think that the term price setting captures much of what people mean when they speak of call out or cancel culture. The two terms differ to the extent that price setting includes offering positive as well as negative incentives, and the phrase price setting has not been used and abused in the way that the phrase cancel culture has. I don't think price setting is a new phenomenon. In fact, I think it's probably existed as long as human beings have existed, and it may even be practiced by other animals too. I also think that price setting is an inevitable consequence of the exercise of certain widely accepted rights and freedoms. For example, if people make use of their freedom of thought and expression to criticize social norms that are prevalent in society, then their opposition to these norms is going to become widely known. As social beings, we have a strong interest in being approved of by others. The perception that others are disapproving of one's behavior is something most people experience as a setback to their interests and so seek to avoid. Hence, the fact that a given kind of behavior is likely to generate disapproval in the minds of others can sometimes serve as an incentive to those who would have otherwise engaged in or expressed support for the behavior to refrain from doing so. So all of this highlights that my use of the language of price setting shouldn't give the impression that the interest advanced or set back must necessarily be monetary or financial. So I think a very wide range of situations or consequences can create the incentives that price setting involves, from threatening to disassociate from someone, so like ostracizing them, to offering assistance and favors to people who behave in the way that you like. But probably the most commonly deployed consequences are social approval and disapproval. So one problem with the discussion about cancel culture is it doesn't distinguish between the kinds of costs that are imposed on people for what is deemed to be bad behavior. So presuming you even agree that the phenomenon is real, all cancellations are kind of grouped together, and people either believe that they're either all fine or all terrible. So I think the language of price setting invites us to make the following crucial distinction between high and low price setting. So as the name suggests, high price setting involves influencing someone to act in a given way by attaching a high price to them not acting in the desired way. So in general, I think attaching a high price involves making it so that the target of price setting's high priority interests are at stake. And high priority interests are just those that are so important that they should be protected by rights. For example, people have high priority interest in bodily integrity, and so I have a right not to be threatened with assault if I don't do as you wish. So low price setting is a form of price setting where the price being attached to the target, not doing as you wish, is anything that is less than a high price. I think that's a really important distinction. It's important because it's pretty widely accepted that high price setting is presumptively impermissible. So by that I just mean that the default position is that you can't do it, and so you need to give a really good justification to explain why you can. So high price setting is presumptively permissible because it involves making it so that people's high priority interests are at stake, so threatening the rights which protect those interests. Many scholars think that providing a good justification for threatening others' rights is going to involve showing that your action satisfies principles, something like the principles of self-defense. And much has been written about this in kind of academic political philosophy and ethics in recent years. So I'm basically just not going to touch that in this paper. I'm just going to try and avoid any discussion of the ethics, because I think there's people who have done that very well already. So because high priority interests are not at stake, low price setting is presumptively permissible, which means that the default position is that you're morally permitted to do it, and so you need to give me some good explanation as to why I can't do low price setting. So the rest of the paper just focuses on the efficacy of price setting as a means of informal activism, not the ethics. So I'm interested in whether it's going to work, not whether you can do it or not, or whether you're morally permitted to do it or not. Because low price setting is presumptively impermissible, so it doesn't trigger any moral concerns itself, I will focus primarily on low price setting, but what I have to say should apply to high price setting as well. Right, section 3, understanding social norms. So I'm going to skip over this very quickly. In order to assess whether price setting works or not, we need to have a better understanding of social norms and how they work. That's what I do in this section. But because it's quite detailed and technical, I'm going to skip over it, most of it in the interest of time. Here's a summary. So a social norm is a rule that a person follows because they believe that most people they care about follow the rule, A, and B, they believe that most people they care about believe that they should also follow the rule. People can continue to follow social norms even if beliefs A and B are false. So for example, it might be the case that no one believes that anyone should follow the rule, but each person pretends, and so makes it seem as though they believe that everyone should follow the rule. The problem with this kind of situation, when people are pretending, is that they're going to stop pretending as soon as the truth is revealed to them. So call a social norm sustained by false beliefs a fragile social norm. The third point is that we can use the 2 points just made to explain the spike in racism and hate crime that followed Donald Trump's election as US President in 2016. So you should all be familiar about what happened after Donald Trump's election. In the following way. So the rules against racism are social norms for many Americans. And the fact that Trump was elected after running such an offensive campaign revealed to many Americans that far fewer people endorse the no racism social norm than they previously believed. So the result is that there are Americans who previously complied with the no racism social norm who no longer do so because they no longer believe that most people they care about endorse the rule. Effectively, the election of Donald Trump as president has highlighted that the no racism rule is not only a social norm for many Americans, but was in fact a fragile social norm prior to the 8th of November 2016. So on to the promise of price setting. So in this section I want to explore how price setting as a means of informal activism might work. So to begin with, we need to draw a distinction between, on the one hand, a person's private attitudes, that is what they personally believe or desire, and on the other hand, a person's public attitudes, that is the beliefs and desires they choose to express publicly. While persuasion as a means of informal activism targets social norms by seeking to target a person's private attitudes, informal activism via price setting targets social norms by creating incentives so that it is in a person's interest to publicly abandon or comply with the social norm in question. So it's a familiar fact of human social life that a person's public attitudes need not perfectly reflect their private attitudes. Nevertheless, I think that it might be possible for price setting that initially only changes a person's public attitudes, so the things that they do in public, not necessarily what they believe, to eventually change their private attitudes. This is what I call the promise of price setting. But I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. I want to focus on what I call the pitfall of price setting. So the pitfall of price setting, and this is the last section, as a form of informal activism, is that it runs the risk of achieving change that is unstable or precarious. This is because of a phenomenon I will call attitude falsification. So to understand this phenomenon, we need to recall just two things that I've just mentioned. So the first is that a person's public attitudes, so the beliefs and desires they choose to express publicly, need not perfectly reflect their private attitudes. That is what they personally believe or desire. The second is that human beings tend to take an interest in other people's private attitudes and to respond in different ways depending on what they believe their private attitudes to be. And they take their public attitudes to reflect what their private attitudes are. So responses to others' attitudes can be negative or positive, and the knowledge that different attitudes are likely to elicit different patterns of responses creates incentives for individuals to manifest whichever public attitude they think that most people like. That's going to give them the highest payoff, basically. So attitude falsification, then, is the act of misrepresenting one's genuine wants under perceived social pressure. Let me give an example of attitude falsification. So, it's widely known that homophobia is still rife in society. So, consider the gay person who seeks to conceal their sexuality by cultivating the impression that they're in a romantic relationship with members of the opposite sex, and even actively discriminating against those who are openly gay. This example shows how attitude falsification can be self-reinforcing. So the gay person who conceals their sexuality by discriminating against those who are openly gay creates incentives for other gay people to also conceal their sexuality, because they don't want to be discriminated against. Hence, their attitude falsification, their pretending themselves, have contributed to the pressure others feel to falsify their attitude as well. So I think informal activism by price setting encourages attitude falsification because it does not seek to change others' behavior by directly targeting their private attitudes. Instead, informal activism by price setting targets their public attitudes, the stuff they show publicly. While this approach may sometimes yield widespread compliance with beneficial social norms, it may do so despite the fact that many of those who comply with the social norms do not in fact endorse the norm. They're pretending. Indeed, many of those who comply with social norms but don't endorse it may, in an effort to conceal their true attitudes, actively contribute to an environment in which compliance with the social norm in question is incentivized. So they might sanction and impose costs on others This means that widespread compliance with social norms secured by price setting alone is at risk of fraying and unraveling. In other words, informal activism by price setting runs the risk of creating what I call fragile social norms. So this is all very abstract. Let me end with an example. For an illustration, consider again the case of the election of Donald Trump. So earlier I suggested that Donald Trump's election highlighted that the no racism rule was not merely a social norm for many Americans, but was in fact a fragile social norm for some prior to the 8th of November 2016. I can now add the following detail to my previous explanation. Prior to 2016, informal activists have been reasonably successful in their efforts to encourage comparatively widespread compliance with the social norms prohibiting the open expression of racism in the United States. However, many of those who complied with these social norms did not in fact personally endorse them. But they were complying with them because of the perceived social pressure to do so. That is, they were engaging in attitude falsification, they were pretending. When Donald Trump ran for president in 2016, he aired sentiments privately harbored by many Americans. And when he won, many of those who harbored these sentiments inferred that many others harbored them too. The perceived social pressure to comply with the social norms prohibiting open expression of racism therefore lessened, and as a result, the incidence of hate crime and overt racism increased. So I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that price setting is always impermissible or ineffective as a form of informal activism. I already mentioned how distinguishing between high and low price setting is important for assessing its permissibility, and I hinted that the fact that price setting might sometimes be effective at changing private attitudes. My point is simply that informal activism by price setting has the drawback that it runs the risk of creating fragile social norms which are vulnerable to fray and unravel in the case of events. So this is what I call the pitfall of price setting. But I've spoken for more than long enough, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening.